at Center on Halsted. My name is Em, and I work here at the Center in Community and Cultural Programming, and we're very glad to have you here today, braving cold and all. So we're at Center on Halsted, which is one of the largest LGBTQ centers in the Midwest, with a bunch of different types of services and programming, Lavender University being the one that you're here for today. And so Lavender University, we're having a 9-month speaker series featuring different leaders, scholars, activists in the LGBTQ community. And today we are going to hear from Owen Daniel-McCarter, who is an attorney here in Chicago, who co-founded the Transformative Justice Law Project, and who also works at Chicago House now. And he'll be able to tell you more about those and about law with trans people from a constitutional law lens. So, Owen, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm going to make this a little bit taller. This is my Blonde Ambition tour. Thank you. Thank you so much, Em, and the Center on Halsted, and thank you to Tracy, Baim, who my understanding is the brains behind this operation, and behind so many different operations, and is really just an important activist and figure in Chicago, I think, for all of us and leaders. So thank you, Tracy. So welcome, everyone. I am, as Em said, I am one of the co-founders of the Transformative Justice Law Project of Illinois, which is a legal organization here in Chicago that provides holistic, life-affirming and gender-affirming legal services to criminalized transgender people. And what that means is that we do work with folks who are currently incarcerated, either in jail or in prison downstate, who are transgender identified, doing a range of different issues, from advising people on their legal rights, their constitutional legal rights under the 8th Amendment for how they're being treated in prison, as well as different types of post-conviction relief, like clemency cases and appeals in criminal convictions. We also do a number of projects on the outside, some of which are legal, some of which are non-legal. Maybe our most successful and well-known project is our name change mobilization, which is a monthly gathering of attorneys and non-attorneys who have been trained in how to do name changes in Illinois, who meet at the Daily Center. You can always find us because we're fantastically queer, looking for the Daily Center. That's basically how we advertise ourselves. But we do have little signs as well, and name tags. But what we do is we help people navigate the name change process, which means we help people fill out their petitions, petition for fee waivers, and we also provide court support for petitioners, so at their later court date, and we'll also accompany them to the DMV or Social Security just to make the whole process a little bit less alienating and to take some of the buffer for all the questions that come around someone's gender identity and gender presentation. And one of our fabulous volunteers is here in the audience, Hunter, who provides a lot of support for that project. So if you're interested in the project, you should either go to our website, tjlp.org, or you can ask one of us. We also do a newsletter with prisoners. It's a zine of prisoners who are incarcerated throughout the country who are transgender. Actually, those prisoners are the people who are writing and editing the zine themselves, and we just provide the people power to make it happen. It's called Hidden Expressions, and you can also find that on our website. It's a way for people who are incarcerated, oftentimes in the same facility as one another, to have conversations about their experiences on the inside with each other and kind of break some of the cycles of isolation that are really enforced in the criminal legal system and the prison system itself. We do a bunch of other stuff, but I'm not going to just do PR for TJLP, even though it is the love of my life. And I think one thing that's important to know before I move on about TJLP is that we really do our work grounded in some important core values. So we don't just see legal practice or these support services that we're providing to criminalized trans people in isolation from a broader movement and a broader move for social change. So we deeply, deeply believe that everybody has the right to gender self-determination, which means that the legal system, our doctors, our lawyers should not be limiting our gender expression, and we should not be punished or restricted from access to different services because of our fabulous, beautiful gender identities in all the varieties that they come in. We also believe in a long-term movement for prison abolition, which is usually kind of a big thing to say. But what that means is actually we really want to eradicate the need for prisons in our society and our system of mass incarceration. So we incarcerate more people in the United States than any country in the world per capita. And I'll talk more about who those people are and why transgender people are folks who experience a heightened rate of incarceration in our society. But instead of putting people in prisons and jails, what prison abolition means is we want to actually solve the root causes of violence and crime in our communities, which prisons don't do, which is why we have so many people in prisons still, and the number's growing. It's actually a really failed system if it's trying to stop violence and crime in our communities. So as a response to that, we are really looking at transformative justice models, which are non-state-driven models that are really community-based for solving real problems that we know are real problems, like violence, particularly anti-trans violence or race-motivated violence in our communities through community accountability structures. So those are our values. I also work at the Trans Life Center at Chicago House. One of my coworkers is here. Hello. And Chicago House is traditionally an HIV services organization that has a housing first model, which means that we provide housing, and we see housing as an important part of HIV prevention. The radical notion that if people have a home, they will take better care of themselves, they'll have more access to medicine, they can stay on their regimen, they can have safer sex practices. It's really, really a wonderful model. And the Trans Life Center was birthed out of Chicago House, and it's a trans-specific program that uses that housing first model. So we actually have a house for folks who are currently homeless, who are trans-identified, that they can move into. And there's supportive wraparound services for our residents and for other people who qualify for the Trans Life Center, including legal representation, employment services, medical and mental health support services, and connecting people into healthcare. So that's another thing I do. I also teach at DePaul University, where we do civil rights cases with some radical people from the People's Law Office. So today, the reason why I'm here is that we're talking about constitutional law as it applies to transgender prisoners. And I'm going to kind of start macroscopically and then narrow down into specifically the issues that trans prisoners face. And if people have questions, I think we're going to do Q&A at the end, right? And there's going to be some multimedia aspects of this on the screen too, so that's exciting. So, as an attorney, I think about the law as being kind of two main things. First of all, it's primarily a way that we have control in our society, right? That we establish norms and expectations of one another, or legislators establish those norms and expectations of us, and then we agree to them or elect new people if we don't like the laws that have been passed. And they function in two main ways. One is kind of setting a tone or a policy. That's kind of the more informal type of social control. Like, we know that we are not supposed to inflict violence on another person, and so we don't do that because we know that that's an agreed upon social code that we have. And then there's the more formal type of social control, which is the actual legal system that is going to penalize you or respond to acting outside of that social code through the criminal system, right? And so one is kind of a preventative measure, and one is really a responsive measure. And so for people who are incarcerated, we're kind of talking about both things at once. That we have people who have been convicted of crimes, and most of those people are people who pled guilty, who never had a trial. Trials don't really happen. Do not believe Law and Order. Television, no, it's live. If we actually went to trial in every single criminal case in our country, the system would grind to a halt, which is one of the activist arguments that Michelle Alexander suggests. She wrote the book, The New Jim Crow, and she talks a lot about mass incarceration as a new form of legalized racism in our society. And so she says every single criminal defendant should demand trial, and then the whole system will just crumble. Only about 3% of convictions in the United States on average are from a trial. Only 3%. That means that most people pled guilty. So whether or not these folks have actually committed crimes is a whole other question. There's also a whole other question of who is surveyed for crimes, what kind of surveillance we're talking about in criminal activity. I would argue, and maybe some folks will disagree with me, but I would argue almost every single one of us has committed a crime at some point in our life, maybe more than one. Whether that's a traffic violation, whether that's a drug crime, whether it's a crime of violence, right? An argument that became an assault or attempted assault, and nobody was there to hear it, right? There was no law enforcement officer there to arrest us. Or if there was a law enforcement officer there, like when we were in high school and caught with, liquor in our high school locker, right? The law enforcement officer gave us a verbal warning and let us go, and it scared us so much that we never did it again, maybe, right? That's that informal type of social control, right? It's the way that we learn not to do something, but we're never actually penalized for it. We don't go through the process. So the folks who are incarcerated, the folks who are in prison, are people who have been prosecuted for some type of criminal action, and most likely have pled guilty to that type of criminal action for a variety of reasons that I'll talk about. Okay, so the prison system as a whole. Why is it important to talk about transgender prisoners specifically? First of all, like I said, we incarcerate more people than any country in the world. We are 20% of the world's prisoners in the United States. There are over 7 million people who are under the guise of some kind of correctional control right now, and over 2 million people who are actually confined in a jail or a prison. So that means we're talking about folks who are in jail, in prison, and also people who are on probation, parole, doing community service, some other type of conditional discharge, but are under correctional supervision in the United States. And the term mass incarceration that people like Michelle Alexander, David Garland, Bruce Western, sociologists have used to describe the very specific system of incarceration in the United States is a term that means not just that we incarcerate more people than any country in the world, which is true per capita, but that we incarcerate very specific groups of people. Not every US citizen has the same risk of being incarcerated in our country. So, who are the most likely to be incarcerated? 1 in 3 black men, on average, can expect to be incarcerated at some point in their lifetime in the United States. In fact, roughly half of the entire prison population is categorized as black men. And I want to say that that is a statistic that also includes black transgender women, because the correctional system does not categorize transgender people according to our gender identities, but instead according to the sex that was assigned to us at birth. So trans women are included in the statistic of men. In fact, in Illinois, just to give you a sense of how extremely sort of horrifying this mass incarceration is in our country, for every African American who's enrolled in a university in Illinois, there are 2.5 African Americans who are in prison in Illinois. So we have just a much, much, much larger and disproportionate rate of black folks being incarcerated. Similarly, we see 1 in 6 Latino men who are incarcerated in the United States, as opposed to the statistic for white men, which is 1 in 17. Right? So we have 1 in 3 for black men, 1 in 6 for Latino men, 1 in 17 for white men. And statistically, the overwhelming number of people who are incarcerated are poor people. Right? So even in the white populations, we're talking about people who are at or below the federal poverty line, which is not a very high line. If you've looked at it recently, it's about $13,500 a year in income per person, right? That's not a lot of money to live on. I say that because over 80% of people who took that guilty plea or maybe went to trial and were found guilty have used a public defender, which means they had to qualify, right, for a state-appointed attorney, which is a constitutional right that we have. So we're talking about overwhelmingly poor people, overwhelmingly people of color. And for women, we talk a lot about men when we're talking about prison populations because 93% of the prison population is male, or the departments of correction categorize them as male. But the fastest growing rates of the prison population are actually Black and Latino women. In fact, since the 1980s, Black women populations in prison have increased almost 600%, which is just really shocking. And some of that has to do with mandatory sentencing structures. Some of it has to do with the removal of a judge's discretion to look at a woman who statistically is more likely to be a drug runner, not a drug dealer, is more likely to be a primary caregiver of children, is more likely to be a first-time offender, and the judge no longer can look at all of those qualities about a defendant and say, in sentencing, actually it makes more sense for you to stay in community as opposed to being in the prison system, because we have new mandatory sentencing structures that really take away a lot of judicial discretion to make those types of decisions. When we talk about transgender people in general, the film that I'm just going to show tiny clips of gives a statistic that about 1 in 3 transgender women can expect to be incarcerated at some point in their life. And we do not have a statewide, countrywide number on that, because again, the departments of correction do not collect the data about how many transgender people are incarcerated. And in the small pockets like Cook County Jail, for example, where they do now collect that type of data, it's data that's based on how the prison or jail facility is categorizing someone. It's determining you are transgender because your hair is long, and because I noticed these things about your body, or because you came in taking estrogen, and therefore we think you're transgender, or on whether somebody self-discloses that they are transgender. And I'll tell you, from working as an attorney with a lot of these people, many people don't disclose that they're transgender because of all of the violence that they can expect to receive as a transgender person, and the scrutiny from the prison or jail facility for being outed as transgender. So even in those pockets where we have either the facility determining someone's trans or someone self-disclosing, I still think those numbers are very low. But the National Center for Transgender Equality and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force did this first national study called Injustice at Every Turn. It was released in 2011. There was a party here when it happened. I remember I was here. And they came and talked to us, and they told us some of the really grim statistics about trans people's access to a bunch of different types of basic human needs like housing, education, medical care, identity documents that reflect who we are. And one statistic that just, when I read it, kind of screamed out at me and finally named something that as an attorney I know to be true, but I'd never seen a statistic that said it before, is that 57%, according to that study, and it's a self-reported study, so again, I think this number is low, but 57% of Black trans people have been incarcerated at some point in their life, according to that study. 57% have been not arrested, but incarcerated at some point in their life. Right? That is staggering to me, and it's absolutely what I know to be true here in Illinois, but finally I saw it on the page. I really encourage you to read that massive report if you haven't yet. It's going to make you very sad, but there's a lot to do. There's a lot we can do about it. So the question is why, right? We know that we have a lot of trans people in prison. I almost wish that that statistic could divide based on trans feminine or trans masculine identities, because I think if we were just looking at transgender women specifically, we would see an even higher percentage of Black transgender women, Latina transgender women. There's a great film by Courtney Ryan Siegler, who is a professor and a Black trans man, called Still Black, about Black trans men's experience. And one of the things that's really interesting about that when we think about criminalization is that some of the Black trans men in the film say, and when I say trans men, I mean people who are assigned female at birth who identify as masculine or as men. Some of the Black trans men in the film report that the policing that they've experienced through their transition is not because they're trans, but because they're being perceived as Black men in society. Right? And so we have that statistic, 1 in 3 Black men can expect to be incarcerated at some point in our lives. But the kind of policing and discrimination that transgender women experience is very specific to gender transgression and to police profiling of trans femininity in our society. Okay, so why do we see so many trans women? Hold on, let me get my water. Why do we see so many trans women in prison? And again, I think it's really important to say trans women in prison, because that's the population that we really see disproportionately incarcerated. I think one reason is the systemic transphobia coupled with systemic racism, right? These things happening in tandem in someone's life, where access to education from the time of birth, right? Access to, and therefore, because of access to education, access to employment, access to safe and stable housing, access to even housing support programs, right? Like homeless shelters or housing programs like at Chicago House. That's part of why we have the Trans Life Centers, because there's a very specific need for housing that is responsive to the needs of transgender people. Medical care that is transgender affirming, which is particularly hard to find when you're a poor person and you're accessing the little shreds of healthcare that you can receive as someone that doesn't have private insurance. And there are still big questions about how the Affordable Care Act is going to impact trans-specific healthcare and gender-affirming healthcare for the marketplace and in Medicaid. So all of those systems working together, identity documents, and we could go on and on about how the systems make it harder in our society to be a transgender person, particularly a trans person of color, pushes people into poverty. And we see that people in poverty are engaging in survival crime or have less privacy to engage in criminal activity. Like I said before, right? We've all committed a crime. I bet you. Every one of us has at least one, maybe more than one. But no one was there to find out. Or maybe they were, right? I don't want to make assumptions about the room. So we see that poor people are engaging in more survival crime, right? And survival crime, what I mean by that is not, your triple count homicide. That may be survival crime in some instances, but generally speaking, when I say survival crime, I mean things like low-level drug trades, personal use, drug possession, retail theft, prostitution, loitering, trespass. These are the types of charges that are crimes against poverty. And some of these charges are the types of charges that start as very small misdemeanor crimes, right? Class A or B misdemeanors like retail theft or prostitution. But after your second charge, after your third charge, they can become felonies. And the state's attorney's office can elect to prosecute you for the exact same behavior, the exact same amount of goods stolen in a retail theft as a felony charge. And suddenly you're doing time downstate in prison for a felony charge. So we see survival crime as one of the reasons why more people are incarcerated, directly linked to poverty, and also the lack of privacy. Right? So not being able to engage in that personal marijuana use in a private space, but instead you're in subsidized housing that has police presence, that has a security system, right, that you had to apply to get into, that has a whole laundry list of rules that can get you kicked out, right? It's being in the public school, it's being in the public hospital, right, when you have a complication due to drug usage, as opposed to having more autonomy over your medical provider. And more control in general. So those are some reasons. Another big reason that we see transgender women specifically in the criminal legal system is profiling. And I was just on a panel yesterday actually at the Legal Assistance Foundation for World AIDS Day, which thankfully there became World AIDS Week, because I feel like we haven't really talked about World AIDS Day enough this year. I don't know if anybody else is feeling that, but it felt like it was noticeably under-discussed this time around. But I was on a panel where some of the panelists were talking about how in Black gay male communities, there's still the constant negotiation between policing and being profiled for Black masculinity. And with trans women, particularly trans women of color, we see a similar type of profiling for trans femininity, particularly around the sex trade and transgender people, transgender women being assumed to be prostitutes, I guess the term is called. I would never use that term. I would say sex worker. And in fact, this problem is so well known and so well documented that our new Chicago Police General Order specifically says that police officers cannot profile someone who's trans as a sex worker or as engaging in prostitution, I think is the actual language of the order. Right? It says that for a reason, because we know that that is a documented issue. Right? Walking while trans, driving while trans, hailing a cab while trans, right? These can all be construed as prostitution. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, like in New York, where we have loitering with intent to prostitute, which is like the vaguest statute that's ever been known in the history of vagueness, really it can be construed as, you know, walking back and forth and talking to people and being trans could be actually a crime in New York. And with loitering with intent to prostitute. So again, with prostitution, right, we have to think about everything that happens. We have the arrest, right, the decision, which is discretionary on the part of law enforcement. Do we arrest this person? Do we stop her? Do we arrest her for prostitution? Right? Then the discretionary decision of the state's attorney's office. Are we going to charge this person with prostitution? Are we going to offer this person the prostitution deterrence program for first-time offenders, which historically has not allowed trans women to use it because it's a women's only program, which is transphobic in its definition of women, right? Are we going to allow them that deterrence program? Are we going to charge them with prostitution? If it's their second charge, are we going to charge them with the misdemeanor or the felony prostitution, right? Are we talking about Cook County jail time, or are we sending this person downstate into IDOC, Illinois Department of Corrections? These are all discretionary decisions. And then if you think, okay, this person also has most likely a public defender, someone who's court appointed. They don't have control over who their attorney is. Does their attorney understand this wealth of, you know, knowledge and history around criminalizing transgender women for engagement in the sex trade and the connection between sex trade, sex offenses, and trans femininity and transgender transgression? Maybe not, right? Maybe that person has 300 other people that they are going to be talking with that day, right? They have 300 clients, right? We have a public defender's office that is way over the ABA recommended caseload for an attorney, right? So is that person going to really be able to sit down and think about the nuances of this person's case? And I'm not talking trash about public defenders. I think that is a incredibly difficult position to be placed in by your employer, to have so many people you need to advocate for. That's really, really hard to be a zealous defender for every individual person. And then if we even think about sentencing, right? The judge is in charge of determining whether or not someone should be on the outside or should be incarcerated as part of their sentence, right? Are they going to be on probation? Are they going to do jail time or prison time? And in that determination, which is also discretionary within certain bounds that are set by the statute, is that person a member of the community? Do they have a family member that they're connected to? Do they have employment? Are they in school? These are the types of questions that the judge is going to be looking for when they're determining, does it make sense to release this person back on the outside? And again, we have systemic transphobia, right, which is unintelligible to most judges, right? Not understanding why somebody might not be connected to their family, why somebody might not have stable employment as a transgender person, and that can be actually used against them in sentencing. Now, the conditions of confinement, right? How people are placed when they're in Cook County Jail awaiting their trial date or the day that they will plead guilty is another question, right? And at Cook County Jail, there is a new policy, new to me, it's from 2011, which is still relatively new in the scheme of policies. But there's a new policy that establishes a gender identity committee. I kind of think of it as like this magical little group of fairies, like in Cinderella, that come down and they're like, oh, what does this person need? Where should they be placed? Should they have their hormones? Should they have a bra? What do we do, right? We do all these things. I don't think it's quite as magical as I'd like it to be, but needless to say, there is now an established committee that reviews every single transgender detainee at Cook County Jail and determines what's safest for them. But one thing that is still true is that that person, that transgender person, is going to be placed in a men's facility. And most trans women are placed in Division 6, which, if you're familiar with the Cook County jail system, is a medium maximum security men's facility that has a protective custody unit on it, which means you have limited interaction with the general population. Or in Division 9, which is a supermax facility where you are in isolation, 23-hour a day, alone by yourself in a cell. Those are the options, both men's facilities. And so somebody might plead guilty if the option is presented to them. You can get out of this situation today, right? If you plead guilty today, you will not be in long-term isolation in a men's jail at 26 in California, right? Or you can push for your trial, right? You'll spend another couple of weeks, maybe a few months, maybe several months if you're fighting a felony case in this situation where you've been removed from your few support systems that you have. Maybe you are not receiving your hormones, or at least not the types of hormones that you want to have, and maybe you'll win. Maybe you'll win your case, and if not, you might go downstate to a men's facility where you don't have the same types of gender identity, gender affirmation. So it makes a lot of sense why somebody might plead guilty, particularly someone who's transgender. There's a lot of information. I'm sort of setting the back burner for why we have all these trans people in prison. So the topic today is constitutional law, right? Not all the issues of policing and profiling, but I think it's important as a framework to get us into constitutional law. So, the Constitution. The Constitution is supreme. And that's what I always say when I start teaching about it, when I teach Dr. Paul. And what I mean when I say the Constitution is supreme is that, I mean, it is the skeleton of our entire government, right? It's the skeleton of the whole system. It is the document that creates a presidency, that creates Congress, right? That creates a judicial system, courts. It is a document that creates certain fundamental rights that we appreciate as U.S. citizens, or at least we know that we have access to them on paper, right? And that's one of the reasons why I started with informal social control and then actual social control, right? Formal social control is that we know that we have the right to freedom of speech, right? We know that. But what does that actually mean, right? And how do we actually enforce that? What happens if the city of Chicago says you can't talk about these things? What happens if we get arrested for standing outside of the center on Halsted and protesting about something, right? What happens, right? That's a restriction on our speech. What happens if the police come into our house and kick down our door and rummage through all of our things and then leave, right? And we're not arrested. They just come in and do that, right? We know that that's not right. We know that we have a constitutional right against unreasonable searches and seizures. That's the Fourth Amendment, right? But how do we actually make the Constitution work for us? And I think it's important, too, when we're thinking about the Constitution, to know that the purpose of the Constitution, right, with the framers, these white guys that wrote this document, right, was to protect us from the government. That's one of the main purposes of the Constitution. It's about limiting the government's control of us, limiting and having some kind of checks on what the government can do to us. How can the government punish us for violating a law? Eighth Amendment says there cannot be unreasonable, cruel, and unusual punishment, right, for a crime. But what does that mean, cruel and unusual punishment, right? We know that we've had to amend the Constitution several times because it didn't say things blatantly enough for our rights to actually matter, right, to actually exist. That's why we have things like the 13th Amendment, which says we cannot involuntarily commit someone to servitude, slavery, with an exception clause, except for punishment for a crime, right? Because we know that prisoners are forced to work all the time. That's part of your sentence, is forced labor oftentimes. We know that we have the 14th Amendment, which is the first time that we see the word equal in the Constitution. The Equal Protection Clause, right, which is a Reconstruction Amendment after the Civil War, which is the first time that we see things like right of citizenship by birth, right? If you are born on the soil, you're a citizen, which is directly trying to amend really awful decisions, like the Dred Scott decision that says that you are not a citizen even if you're born here, if you were formerly enslaved, even if you were freed by your master, right? So we had to make some amendments to the Constitution. But the Constitution overall is about interpretation as well, right? This document, it doesn't say that much, right? What does equal protection even mean? What does due process even mean? What does the right to freedom of expression actually mean? And one of the tasks of the judicial branch is to interpret the Constitution, which is a very powerful task. So the court system, judges, get to interpret the meaning of the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say we have a right to privacy, a right to have elected abortions, all this red tape now, right? It doesn't say that we have the right to contraceptives. It doesn't say that we have the right to have consensual gay sex in our home with one other adult consenting person, right? Lawrence v. Texas. But we have interpreted that that's what it means. The spirit of the Constitution is protecting these types of rights. And the spirit of the Constitution, we're seeing growingly, is protecting the right to marry someone that you love, regardless of their gender. And we frequently see that now the spirit of the Constitution is moving towards trans-specific rights, and that there's some sort of protections for trans people, particularly trans people in prison, against certain types of treatment while incarcerated. So the Constitution is supreme, right? It controls everything. It also is specific to the government, right? So I often joke in my classes at DePaul that you can't say to your mom, and my mom is here and she's fabulous and wonderful, you can't say to your mom, you can't tell me not to talk like that, I have a First Amendment right to freedom of speech, right? I have no constitutional right with my mother, none. My mom is not the government, as far as I know. She's not a state actor. Yeah, she's not a state actor. She is not the police, right? She is not a law that is telling me I can't talk. My mom actually can tell me not to talk. And there could be some, restrictions and punishments for that within the bounds of the law, right? The government, however, right, potentially my school teacher, potentially my boss if I'm a state or federal employee, telling me that I can't say something is a very different matter, right? Because the Constitution requires a state actor. It requires that the government is involved somehow. We also have these kind of laws, legislation, regulations, administrative codes that are also not the Constitution, right? So like the City of Chicago Commission on Human Relations, the City of Chicago Human Rights Ordinance is not the Constitution. Does it say that I can't be discriminated against because I'm transgender? Yes, sort of. It says I can't be discriminated on the basis of my gender identity, right? That's not a constitutional right, though. That's a right that's been created by a municipality within that municipality, right? So it often gets confusing when we think about Constitution. The Constitution actually it does a little bit less, but more than we think it does. And our municipal ordinances, our countywide ordinances, our state ordinances actually cast much wider protections. And Congress, if we're thinking of the federal Constitution, you'll see that Congress actually has authority to pass certain types of legislation to enact the spirit or the meaning of the Constitution, right? So if you look at the 14th Amendment, which is that big amendment with Equal Protection Clause and Due Process Clause, you'll see that the last section, Section 5, gives Congress authority to enforce that amendment. So that means that Congress can enact statutes like the Voting Rights Act, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? Title VII, Title IX, all these things that have huge, huge impact on our history, on our society, right? They are allowed to enact those through the Constitution, but they're not constitutional rights necessarily because they're statutes. It's just very confusing. I say all of this because it's important when we understand in the prison context. Most of the time in the prison context, we're talking about the 8th Amendment. And the 8th Amendment says, I'll just read it to you. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Period. That's all it says. And so What does that mean? It's the statute that really governs anybody who's incarcerated, right? Anyone who is serving a sentence, because it's about that punishment, the fines, the fees, the sentencing imposed. Does this mean that when someone steals, a loaf of bread, they can be sent to prison for the rest of their life, right? That's going to be an Eighth Amendment issue, right? About the gravity of the punishment in relationship to the offense. And you'll see some cases about that, like in California, the 3 strikes rule. Someone stole some golf clubs and received life in prison because it was their 3rd felony offense under the 3 strikes rule. And so the question is, does this violate the Eighth Amendment? Right? You'll also see, particularly in the prisoner context with trans prisoners, the issue of placement. Right? This is a big issue for prisoners. Am I going to be placed with men because I'm a transgender woman and the facility is seeing me as male? Am I going to be placed with women because my gender identity is female and maybe I've had some surgeries that affirm that gender identity? Maybe I've been on hormones for 8 years which have changed my secondary sex characteristics so that I appear to be female, whatever that means, a non-trans woman. I'm passing, right? Will I be placed with women then? Or will I be placed in isolation because the facility doesn't know what to do with me? And isolation inside of the Department of Corrections is a way to punish prisoners for breaking rules within the prison, right? It's kind of a privilege that you get to be in the general population. And if you do something violent, if you commit a sexual act, even things like insolence, disobeying orders, can mean you have time in isolation, segregation, solitary confinement. There's a lot of different words we use for the same thing in the prison system. And so sometimes trans people are placed in that solitary confinement just because they're trans. So you can think about it as being punished because you're trans, right? We punish people for violating the rules of the prison by putting them in isolation. You just get put in isolation just because you're trans. And we don't have a facility for you. So thinking about courts that have interpreted the Constitution, there is the landmark case that's exactly about this issue of a transgender prisoner and where she should be placed. And the case is called Farmer versus Brennan. And it's about Dee Farmer, who is a fierce and fabulous transgender woman who was incarcerated in a federal prison, actually in Indiana. A lot of these trans prisoner cases are in the Midwest. But that's just a side note. Maybe it's because trans people in the Midwest have particular zeal and fighting power. Because I don't think it's specific to just the issues being in the Midwest. So Farmer versus Brennan involved Dee Brennan. This went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it is our landmark case on the issue of prisoner safety and where they're being placed. And she was placed in the men's general population when she was transferred from one federal facility to another. And when she was transferred, she was subject to extreme violence from other inmates, including physical and sexual violence, so much so that she actually contracted HIV from treatment from other prisoners. And she sued. And maybe in Q&A I'll get into the complications of actually suing as a prisoner, because it's very hard to do and there's some specific restrictions, but I don't think I have to get into it here, but if you're interested in knowing about that. Somehow she was able to sue, and she got all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that when a prison official is aware of a risk to an inmate of physical or sexual violence and intentionally disregards that risk, intentional is the important part of this, right? The prison official has to know and intentionally disregard the risk. It's a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Right? It's a violation of that freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. So I think at this time, let's do that little